Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to Kaizen Central from Manufacturing TV. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to present some absolutely top speakers tonight, Beverly Nielsen and Steve McCabe, who are next week publishing a book they've written, going to be published by Bite-Sized Books, whose owner is indeed with us on this call, Julian Costley. The book is called Exploring the Green Economy, Issues, Challenges and Benefits. And it has some really top contributions from some top contributors. And the idea is to explore what the green economy means, what are the implications for manufacturing, obviously, because we are a manufacturing media outlet. But I think that manufacturing doesn't exist in a silo. It exists as a very important integral part of the wider UK economy and, of course, society. So perhaps if I could invite Beverly and Steve to perhaps tell us, number one, what prompted you to address this issue? I know it's a big issue this year, of course, but what prompted you to write this book?
Well, thanks so much for the introduction, Nick, and I'm delighted to see Julian here as well. And Steve, I think, will probably take us through some sort of perhaps introductory material in a minute or two. I can say from my own point of view that I was certainly prompted by becoming involved in a recent APPG all-party parliamentary group on green manufacturing, and run by Policy Connect. It was starting to look at what is green manufacturing, what does it look like, and in fact their report is being launched next week. But clearly introduced me personally to a lot of very interesting people thinking about this subject. It was chaired by Lord Billamoria, and vice chairs came from the sort of three parties, Conservative, Labour and Lib Dem. And it sort of came up with a number of very interesting recommendations. It looked at three themes around resilience, sustainability and global competitiveness and skills. And I think, you know, probably before I talk too much, you might want to if I pass over to my colleague, Steve McCabe, who could sort of take us perhaps through some sort of introductory themes and thoughts that would enable and facilitate greater discussion. But perhaps just a couple of words on resilience and sustainability and skills. I mean, skills, you'll all be familiar with the challenges that manufacturing has in recruiting skills, and particularly STEM skills, access to STEM skills. And I suppose with green manufacturing in particular, that's a heightened risk. In terms of sustainability and global competitiveness, one of their key recommendations, and I'd actually be really interested in your feedback on this, was bringing forward government recommendations for labelling about embedded carbon in products. And they're talking about 2025. So I'd be very interested in your thoughts on that. And they were really sort of asking the government to recommit it to its election pledge of delivering gigabit capable broadband to every home in the UK by 2025, and saw the digital agenda as really key to the delivery of sustainability and resilience for UK manufacturing. There were quite a few other interesting recommendations which I could come on to, but I think that really is enough in terms of just a few words of what sort of stimulated my involvement. And I'm really pleased to pass over to Dr. Steve McCabe, who has done so much in pulling the material together. So Steve, over to you. Are you able to share your presentation, Steve?
I believe so.
Okay.
Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Hang on. Oh, good. Trying to remember which one it is that I want to go on total screen. I don't do that. Yeah, I've got it. I've got it. That's it. Okay. And can I also say, whatever Alec is having, I'll have one of those in the break, in the interval. It looked delicious. It looked like a Magnum to me. Right. Okay. Those of you that have been around for a while will know that I've pinched the sort of title. The way we work, rest and play, that was actually a sort of a byline for sort of selling of the Mars bar. But of course, the whole point about selling Mars bars was that it was something that sort of aided everything we do. And I think green is in essence something that we've got to get into all of our lives in every way, shape or form. The real difficulty, I may say, is that sort of the challenge is not inconsiderable, and the more we delay, the worse it gets. So what I'm going to do with your indulgence is just to very quickly run through some of the sort of the slides, or the slides are taken from the introductory chapter by and large, of what the sort of the nature of the problem is. Now, of course, for those who are sort of not aware, that's the sort of the cover of the book, which was produced very ably in the last week or so. I believe actually it's available now if you go on Amazon. Those who are sort of very keen to get hold of it, but you may want to say a couple of words about that later. Okay, right. Greenhouse gases, for those that are not aware, the issue is mainly carbon dioxide, but methane and nitrous oxide. And of course, what you see there in that sort of chart, I'm not going to delay this, is that sort of fairly sort of level up until sort of the, if you could sort of work this out, about the 1800s. What happened in the 1800s? We had the Industrial Revolution, and the rest, as they say, is history. I'm going to sort of move over. Common greenhouse gases, you can see there, the majority are absolutely carbon dioxide, but of course methane, nitrous oxide, and the fluoride gases that sort of come from lots of other processes all contribute. Now, of course, these are sort of things that we've heard about in recent years, but of course, the impact is becoming all the sort of the more important, because as we've sort of seen in the sort of headlines in the sort of the heat domes in Canada and the sort of Seattle, and also of course Lapland, which of course is a place we associate with Father Christmas in Finland, recording a temperature of 33.6 this week, which is unseasonably sort of warm, and we're going to get a lot more of this. What's important actually, and when you look at the sort of the origins, is where it comes from. Now, quite clearly, electricity and sort of heat production makes up the sort of the large amount, 25%. I was actually surprised when I sort of looked at these figures. Next comes agriculture. So of course, there's a sort of big impact to be made there. Then of course, third comes industry. But of course, as is always the case, once you start drilling down into this, you find out it covers a multitude of sins: transportation, buildings, and other sort of forms of energy. And of course, I do appreciate the sort of the base of this is a little dated, but of course, it won't have moved that much. What we can see is everything we do contributes. Now, of course, what's also really interesting is that when you look at the sort of where it comes from, China is the sort of the big offender, followed by, the others, which of course the rest of the world. The EU, which of course technically includes ourselves when this was carried out, is 9%. And of course, the difficulty is that if we don't get everyone on board, then it doesn't count for very much, because of course what we do as a country makes no difference if our next door neighbours or people outside the world are polluting. So that is of course the sort of the big challenge. Whoops. This is the sort of the most important slide. What does it do? Well, of course, before we had the sort of the buildup of greenhouse gases, the heat would sort of be radiated back out into space, so it come in from the sun and go out. Of course, the problem now is it gets trapped in there, and we get the so-called greenhouse effect. Anybody who's ever sort of had a greenhouse will know when the sun shines, it can become extremely hot, and of course, that's what we're sort of beginning to experience. So to move on. Most importantly, what can we identify? And you see here, and I take this from the sort of meteorological data, which was published by the BBC, since 1850, which is the sort of the notable sort of point, when the Industrial Revolution is believed to be in its sort of zenith, then you can see that it's gone up. And in fact, in the last 40 years, the sort of the impact has been ever greater. And what that's led to, of course, this is up to date. That these are sort of the hot spots at the moment, as you can see, sort of mainly in South America, Europe, and a bit of Africa. But we're all going to experience it. And look at that sort of temperature, 51.8 degrees, which is down. I'm trying to work out where that is. Anyway, you can sort that yourselves. What's important is that on average, we become 1.2 degrees centigrade hotter. But of course, averages, that covers the multitude of sins. And in some places, the sort of the average temperature has gone up by 5 to 10 degrees. So, you know, this means that we're sort of getting the sort of the temperatures, and you see in the sort of the last bullet point, above which survival becomes a big problem. And this is something we should be aware of, the so-called wet bulb temperature reading, that if it goes above 35 degrees centigrade, we can't sweat. And that's when sort of deaths occur. And those of us who are in the UK in the summer of 2003 will remember the temperature went over 100 degrees. And that heat wave was believed to have sort of accounted for 70,000 deaths in Europe, which I know we're going through a pandemic. But of course, what is important to remember is that extreme temperature, whether it be sort of the extreme cold or the extreme heat, which is on the up and up, it kills 5 million a year. Now, I believe when I sort of last looked that something like 4 million people had died of COVID, which gives us an indication of the sort of the level of the crisis. So we're facing a COVID every year unless we do something. I took a few headlines out just to sort of demonstrate that you know, this was in the sort of the New Scientist yesterday, that the North American heat wave was 150 times more likely because of climate change. I'm always acutely conscious that sort of when you talk to people, that many people say, well, we've been through sort of temperatures which have gone up and down, which over the sort of the millennia, you know, over millions and millions of years. But undoubtedly, you know, this is something different. And of course, the sort of the data indicates that it is quite particular. Given sort of the amount of gunk we put into the atmosphere as a result of the processes. This one is particularly shocking. 8 billion people at risk of malaria and dengue, you know, which are particularly unpleasant. I mean, what we're talking about is the vast majority of the world's population. It's quite incredible what the potential for this is. And I include this because I'm not I buy the Telegraph or subscribe because of course the business page is good, but I always think that if the Telegraph is starting to sort of sit up, then you know that something is wrong, because of course, dare I say, and I'm happy to sort of to be challenged on this, the Telegraph feeders tend to be the sort of the most skeptical of the people I come across in terms of climate change. So again, a texty sort of slide, I accept, but of course what the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who sort of run this, and they're going to be producing a report for COP26, which is happening later on this year, which of course is the big event where of course all the nations are supposed to get together and agree their strategies. They're saying if we don't do something, we're in danger of a widespread and possibly irrevocable disaster. And what they're also particularly concerned about, as the temperatures go up, we have the sort of the polar caps which are sort of melting. And just as a matter of interest, I don't know if anybody's watching the Tour de France, and they in the sort of the commentary, they talked to various people as a kind of a bit of a vox pop about sort of local things, and they were going in the mountains. And in one place, they had a scientist who said that sort of in 1980, the depth of sort of the ice cap, or whatever you care to call it, was something like 100 meters. It's now 30 meters, so it's lost 70 meters of ice in the space of 40 years. And what this may sort of do is unfreeze the soil, releasing methane, which of course it just doubles down on the sort of the effect that makes things worse. So what have we got to do? We've got to sort of reduce our greenhouse gases, as well as the phenomenal amounts of waste that we produce. And this is what sort of led to sort of the green economy. And I'm going to just, I'll leave that for you to look at. There's a whole host of things which Beverly will talk about in a couple of moments in terms of the sort of contributors of the book. What we've got to be aware of is that we all play our part, but it requires governments, it requires the organizations, it requires business in particular to engage in action. But it's a whole panoply of things. But we can't afford to wait. I think that's the sort of the important thing that sort of comes out of the work I've done on myself and Beverly. What I did, I include this only to suggest that it's not going to be cheap. I mean, the Climate Change Committee, which is part of government, in their 6th carbon budget last December, they were saying on average it will take something like 44.5 billion. And you know, we talk about billions as if they're sort of throwaway numbers. It's a lot of money, but if we're going to get sort of to net zero by 2050, that's going to cost us over 1.3 trillion. But in this report, what they did sort of say is that sort of it's a worthwhile investment, and the sort of the fact is that we will move to a different type of economy, which will produce opportunities. It will certainly sort of produce innovation and creativity, which of course goes with it, which is what we were talking about with Andrew Sentence last week. But of course, this is useful because it tells us that there's sort of a wide range of activities. Interestingly, of course, manufacturing and construction get lumped together. You can see it's actually quite a sort of thin line. So what manufacturing can do is quite limited in comparison to sort of a lot of the other areas. But you can sort of see here, if we don't get started very soon at this end and ramp up the investment, we're not going to get the sort of the benefits that sort of accrue. And okay, and perhaps it's a good point at which to sort of to hand over to Beverly, and she can talk further about what was in the book, and indeed what we'd like to do is to sort of to generate some sort of discussion in terms of yourselves as to sort of what you think you can do, because of course, as I indicate there, we're actually working on sort of the follow-up book, which we hope to have ready for the sort of the COP26 conference in November, which is actually specifically about green manufacturing. Over to you, Beverly.
Thanks so much, Steve. And Steve, you might want to stop sharing as well, if that's okay. Just I know you want to return to those questions. Are you okay to do that, Steve?
I'll do it for you.
Oh, thanks so much. Thanks. Very nice to be able to see everybody again. And I'm conscious that we do want to have a discussion, so I'm not going to spend too long talking. But I think just to pick up on what Steve's saying, looking at the really big picture globally, we in our parliamentary commission were very conscious that as a country we hadn't hit either our 4th or 5th carbon budget targets, and the 6th carbon budget, as you probably are aware, sets really quite stretching targets to reduce our emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions, by 78% by 2035. So those will be enshrined into law, and it's clearly a very demanding target. I did just say I would return to some of the recommendations that I think you as manufacturers be particularly interested to hear about in our report. Another one was that we looked more at best practice as ever, and that we tried to assist best practice transfer by creating a new body, something like the Manufacturing Advisory Service, which had been disbanded. So that's back on the cards. And on the skills front, there was talk about the Green Jobs Task Force becoming a permanent body, with the working very closely with the newly established Skills and Productivity Board. So that would look at the skills gaps brought about through the green economy, and actually coming up with a means of delivering that for manufacturers. Now, Steve said that I would just quickly highlight perhaps one or two of the other contributors' thoughts in the chapters throughout the book. And I feel that Vicky Price, who's a contributor to the book, The Economist, she really focused on some of the thoughts of Lord Stern in the Stern Review of 2006, when Lord Stern was saying, if we don't do anything, it's going to cost between 5 and 20% of GDP on an annual basis in the future. And that if we were investing between 1 and 2% of GDP, we would save the devastating impact. And she looks in quite some detail, quite interesting thoughts about how we discount the rate of future investment and the impact of our investment on future generations. And Lord Stern had recommended a particularly low discount rate for investment in the future of 0.1% and averaging at 1.4% overall, which I thought was quite interesting. She says that through the move towards ESG fund investment, 33% of funds under management are now coming under ESG categories. But she highlights that in terms of environmental tax yield, that's actually fallen from 97 at 8.4% of net yield to 7% of government takings. I think in terms of waste, something, the circular economy, which actually Steve writes a lot about in the book, she highlights that of the 92.8 billion tons of waste, minerals, fossil fuels, metals and biomass, only 9% globally is recycled. Tony Juniper, one of our authors, he talks about the mismatch between human demand for economic system and their workings, and what the natural system can sustainably supply. And he talks about the economy being a human construct, but ecology being a finite system. Jonathan Porrat, he has a bit of a go at BlackRock, quite an entertaining start to his chapter, in which he sort of speaks about how fed up he is hearing about their prognostications on ESG investments. And he does highlight that of the $9 trillion of assets under investment from BlackRock, 85 billion are still invested in coal companies. And he talks about really the need to remodel capitalism to take it away from maximizing shareholder returns and the duties of shareholders in that in the need to look at short-term profit. And then there's quite a range of contributions then looking at the practical implications and what we can actually all do and what is going on, whether it's in steel production, whether it's in energy production, whether it's in home building. And in my own chapter, I've looked at one of the lesser known green gases, biomethane production, because if we can capture and harness methane and stop it being emitted into the atmosphere, it's 34 times more harmful as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So by capturing it, harnessing it as a powerful source of energy, 1 kilogram of biomethane it actually can produce the equivalent of well over 1 litre of either petrol or diesel, and yet it's not often mentioned or thought about as a source of energy. So, and finally, actually, one of the most interesting, I think, chapters in terms of practical contributions to the discussion is from Craig Sams, the who talks about how we've got this gap between the greenhouse gas emissions from in particular fossil fuels and farming, which amount to 43 billion tonnes a year, and what the land can capture at 20 billion tonnes a year. And so there's this 23 billion tonnes of greenhouse gas that we need to do something with. And Craig Sams, he comes up with some really interesting ways we could capture way over that 23 billion tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions through different uses of our soils, production of glulam, a super hardwood, more growth of hemp, which is particularly sort of virulent weed actually, and biochar, the use and production of biochar, as well as growing wildflowers as hay. And he comes up with 108 billion tonnes of opportunity to capture greenhouse gases. So his is a very practical chapter. So I hope that gives some food for thought, and we can set running a lot of discussion and any questions. And thank you very much for the opportunity, Nick.
Oh, Beverly, Stephen, bless you. No, that's great. I thought what was interesting was that slice you showed, Steve, of EU 28, which of course is now EU 27. We must be, a sliver of that. And yet we are taking this incredibly seriously. And although that is not to say we shouldn't, the fact that there are so many other countries around the world where this is taken perhaps not as seriously, some places maybe more, I don't know. But the fact is that although it's wildly virtuous, it doesn't work unless everybody does it. And that all it takes is China to go south on us and launch an attack on Taiwan or whatever, and any hopes of getting any kind of international cooperation on anything are done and dusted. But clearly it's an initiative, not just an initiative, it's a revolution that's happening even as we speak. Richard, you've got your hand up, please. Delighted to see you this evening. Please go ahead.
Hi everybody. Super presentation, Beverly and Stephen. Thank you very much. I'm a mechanical engineer, and I've done a lot of work in wind power. I worked with the Siemens Gamesa in Brander in Denmark on an assignment a few years ago to basically debottleneck the factory. And they've clearly been, as well as GE, have been very successful in the commercialization of wind power, particularly offshore wind power. My question is twofold, really. First of all, it's been a great success because of the industrialization side of it, and the fact that government money was put in the beginning to get the necessary scale. But these things are huge, and they're now 220 meters diameter, and clearly the entire coast of the UK is going to be covered with these things, which I fully support. But they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and there's an alternative to it, and a yes and, which is tidal power, and basically water turbines. And water is 800 times more dense than air. And I just wonder why we put so much emphasis in the world, not just the UK, on wind power, when we could do tidal power, we could do the Severn Barrage, we could do the Liverpool estuary, the Firth of Forth has got some up there. So that's one question. The other question is a political one, really, which is coal. And so China is clearly building coal-fired power stations still at a massive rate, and it's a huge polluter. But Germany is still burning coal, and Germany is burning lignite, brown coal. So we can't really have a go at China until the first world, if you like, sorts its own game out. And I'm just staggered that within the EU, Germany has managed to get away with it. So a number of points there. I could talk to you all day. And thank you.
Yeah,
by the way, just to chip in, did you see the article in the Telegraph yesterday about wind power?
No.
Yeah, it's worth having a look at, because they're saying it's in danger of flowering, and you're absolutely right, because of the size of these things, and the logistics are increasing, and the government are putting, as you say, all their, if I forgive the sort of the pun, the eggs in this particular basket. And the view is that we need a sort of much more balanced portfolio. But I fully accept the sort of point about
it's great for levelling up in the northeast. I'm sure the people in Siemens Gamesa on the Humber and GE on Teesside are bringing loads of jobs up into the northeast and reinvigorating the ports. Yeah. But it's just huge amounts of logistics when you could get the same amount of power from serious amounts of industrialization of water turbines.
Absolutely.
I sometimes think that you can only sort of get our minds in government around a couple of subjects at once, and sort of the EV issue is one at the moment, and hydrogen is another.
Yeah.
And when you look at
hydrogen too.
Yeah, and when you look at the industrial decarbonisation strategy which the government came out with, it was 12 billion of funding to the areas that would be basically involved in the production of hydrogen and offshore wind. And so that was about coastal areas largely, and they were the sort of heavy energy using areas that were prioritized. Then you had their sort of dispersed industrial clusters, and those were the secondary areas, and nothing would be done with them until 2030. No funding is directed at them, and so then it's sort of up to them, like the Midlands, which would be in that cluster, sort of to come up with their own sort of energy sources and funding, because they wouldn't be prioritized for funding in that plan. So rapid sort of decarbonisation of industrial clusters, heavy industrial clusters is the focus. And I just think it might also be about life cycle development, that if and I don't know the answer to this, frankly, Richard, but if tidal power is at a pre-commercial stage still, then it may be that it isn't getting the attention that we've had 20 years of focus or plus on batteries, and we've just got to batteries to near commercial stage. So it could be about the life cycle, it could be, but I mean, I just find personally that there's only a limited attention, and only certain things seem to get that attention. And it's like the biomethane, which is a circular economy green gas produced from natural organic waste materials. It happens naturally. And sort of, you know, there's a general feeling, well, it can only account for 6% of the gas grid, and it's under 1% at the moment. But you know, we used to have hardly any diesel until we all decided we were going to use masses of it, and then the supply of it expanded massively. So I think the lobbying, you know, there've got to be lots of lobbying and in the networks, and keep the profile really high of these things, especially if they're still pre-revenue or, you know, pre-commercial stage. That would be my feeling on the tidal power. I don't really know enough about it, in all honesty.
Well, I think it looks like the next bet is on hydrogen, and that's a great idea, obviously, because it's not got the calorific value of methane, but it's you can make it relatively easily by electrolysis of weak sulfuric acid. But the worry for me is that we're making bets on things like hydrogen, and we're only just about starting up EVs with batteries that we can't recycle. And yet now we're saying, actually, fuel cells, which have been around for years, but we can commercialize them just as we commercialized wind power. That could be the next bet of chemical engineering. And I see that Jim Ratcliffe from INEOS is going to be pushing the hydrogen agenda too. But it just seems to me that we had a great, you know, we had a joker, if you like, with water power, but nobody seems to want to go with it. And maybe we just sort of shut up and just say, let's go with hydrogen and fuel cells and carbon capture. I just think it's such a huge card to have missed.
I think personally, I think the challenge is so enormous. I mean, I think Jonathan Porrat makes a very good point in his chapter that if you take all of the commitments of the nations that are, you know, in their national plans ahead of COP26, it amounts to a 1% cut in carbon emissions when we need a 50% cut by 2030 over the next decade. So we're just miles off what we have to do. And I think in the first chapter, you know, that really largely written by Steve, but, you know, he highlights that I think that 30% of energy globally is still produced by coal, 92%, was it 92%, Steve, is produced from fossil fuel, or 82% it might be, but anyway, it's the majority, a very big majority globally is produced from fossil fuel. The challenge is just so enormous, and the impacts which seem to be accelerating of climate change on our planet, and as Steve highlighted through the Lapland and British Columbia, Canadian temperatures, are so devastating that, you know, we really have to do everything we can. And I personally think that everybody has to be engaged in the discussion. And so, Richard, you know, I just saw other people in the chat were saying Swansea Bay and Firth of Forth, and, you know, we've got all this amazing water. We're an island. You know, we maybe haven't done a lot with hydro, but we could do a lot with tidal. So
well, we know about turbines. You know, we know a hell of a lot about turbines. We probably lead the world apart from America on turbines, and yet, you know, as I say, it just seems like an own goal not to have done anything.
Yeah, well, I think we need to keep pushing. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I was only going to say that one of the things I came across, that it's, I would say, electric cars, that they're the big thing, but hands up those who've rushed out to buy an electric car. They're phenomenally expensive. I hope we reach the tipping point. As I remember as a child, only posh people had colour TVs. Then all of a sudden they became cheap enough for everyone to have. The reality is, of course, if we all rushed out and bought our electric cars, assuming we could get hold of them, how are we going to charge them? Because I don't think we've got enough capacity. But hey, that's another issue. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, I wanted to bring in Ram, who's had his hand up. And Richard, thank you. That was a great contribution. And somebody mentioned Swansea Bay. The Tidal Basin project was actually nixed by government. That was not just an aspiration. That was actually a project. And they said no. And I felt very sad when that happened 2 or 3, 4 years ago, whatever it was. Ram, good evening.
Good evening, everybody. Firstly, Beverly, Stephen, whenever you're doing book signings, please let us know. I would the copy signed by the authors, collector's item. Now, Stephen, I completely agree with you about the electric cars. How are we going to charge them? More importantly, what are we going to do when we are stuck on the M6 and the battery is rapidly wearing down? Right now, the thing I'm talking about is we speak about green economy, right? I asked Nick a question earlier on LinkedIn. How green is green, and how far down the supply chain do we have to go to be, green as, as it gets? Number one. Secondly, we speak about sustainability. We speak about innovation. We speak about resilience. We cannot talk about each of these in isolation, because resilience is a human character, which is what has led to innovation throughout the ages. And innovation, according to the way I define it, which makes sense to me, is any human effort or endeavor that enables us to survive, grow, prosper, and be sustainable, for me, characterizes innovation. When you talk about prosperity, you talk about safety, money making, commercial, all of that. And sustainable is important, because if we are not sustainable today, we will not have an opportunity for the future generations to survive, grow, and prosper. I mean, for me, it's personal, because I just put it rare, right? My daughter is 10 months old as of today, and I want her to survive, grow, prosper, and be sustainable, and her kids. So we cannot isolate innovation, sustainability, and resilience from each other. And we have to talk about all of them as a collective. And that's what we need to be talking about. Don't isolate it. Talk about them as a collective. And one final thing is, Richard, I don't think you're going to like what I'm going to say, Richard Jones. We must question China, because one single country responsible for 30% of carbon emissions on the planet is not agreeable, while the rest of the world is much lower than that. We must question it, take it up against them, and do what needs to be done. We cannot say, oh, we can't have a go at them when we have Germany here. How much is Germany's emission compared to China? So that is a big number. 30% is a huge number, and we must take it up and question all of us, and of course the perpetrators as well. Right, I will shut up now. Thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you, Ram. And congratulations on your 10-month-old daughter. That's wonderful. I hope you get some sleep. But I think the China thing isn't quite as straightforward as it looks, as Steve, comments in his chapter, because we're buying a lot of the stuff that China is making, and they're exporting 20% of their GDP. So we have a responsibility there as well, ourselves in the developed economies. And I suppose the other thing is that there is this notion of climate fairness and justice, social justice around climate change, that we, the developed nations, have emitted over many, many years. And if you take our historic footprint into account, then it looks a bit different to that pie chart that Steve showed us. And there is a very interesting Professor Tim Jackson at Surrey University, who has sort of come up with a based on the total global emissions that we think we've got remaining to us if we're to stay within the 1.5 degrees C. And he's come up with a sort of budget for Britain and a budget for every other country, but based on the notions of our previous emissions. So and that budget we could use up in the next 10 years. And he talks about how if we want to stay in our budget based on notions of fairness and justice and so forth, we have to cut emissions by 24% every year for the next 10 years. So I mean, China is clearly, we need them to get in line, and they have said they'll be net zero by 2060, which at least is a step forward. But to get even to net zero by 2050 for us requires massive changes that I don't think we've got our minds around at all yet. Steve, did you want to add anything?
No, actually, I only just to pick up on the fact that Stephen has mentioned, I think I've interpreted this correctly, nuclear power. I've never been, I'll be honest, a big fan of nuclear, but I begin to recognise that maybe nuclear has a role to play in all of this. I appreciate that there's a lot of concerns about it, but if we need energy, it's probably and less, how long does it take to build a nuclear power station, as we're seeing with Hinkley B, it becomes part of the mixture, I guess, and it's that balanced portfolio. But no, I think that other people have got their hands up, so I prefer to hear from them.
Well, just point about the cars, by the way, cars at the side of the road. I don't know if you saw picture of a melted Tesla the other day. It took 250,000 gallons of water to put the battery fire out. And an ICE that goes up in flames takes on average about 300 gallons.
Wow.
That's a regular occurrence, to be fair. I mean, there's, I'd say it's happening every week. And of course,
Or
let's face it.
Melton Teslas. You say
Sorry, I
Tesla
didn't catch.
going up flames. Yeah.
Yeah,
it's-
absolutely. So when there's more of them, yeah, that
Well, I mean-
will also be.
Yeah. Julian, good evening.
Oh, you're muted.
You're
Okay,
muted.
was I ahead of Graham? I don't want to.
Oh, I'm sorry. I only go by top left, whatever's in the.
All right. Okay. Well, two things that may be helpful apropos the book, and then I have a question, actually, having read the book, of course, to ask Steve and Beverly. The first is I put in the chat the Amazon link to the book, which I think was published today or yesterday, I can't remember, very much with the assistance of my chairman and the founder of the publishing company. You can always dive in and solve problems at short notice. The second is that Beverly or Steve, I don't know whether you want to mention, and I put the link in the chat as well, the 16th of July. I've put the Zoom link and the passcode in there. You might want to say something about what that event is for people to
Yes, thank you.
participate. But I'll pose my question, and this is I've been fascinated recently by the it didn't even occur to me the amount of energy required in every Bitcoin transaction. And while you were speaking, I found out that a single Bitcoin manufacturing, it says transaction when I was Googling it just now, is 707 kilowatt hours, which apparently is enough to support a US household for 24 days. Now, the issue isn't Bitcoins, it's blockchain. And while we're doing all these positive things to reduce energy, we have, coming up the outside, on the outside lane, blockchain, which could be absolutely phenomenal in terms of energy consumption. And it's a question for you both, to what extent in your thinking and research when you were putting the book together, did you give consideration about the implications of blockchain?
Steve, I'll pass that one to you.
I thought you might. I'll be honest. I'm obviously aware of the issues of Bitcoin. Again, is it sort of it takes to make one Bitcoin something like that the energy of a small country. I mean, it's phenomenal. You've got these computers rattling away all day. I'll be honest, but blockchain, I can just about get my head around Bitcoin, all the sort of cyber currencies, and quite clearly they will be the future. Blockchain, it's kind of another dimension. So maybe I'm too old. I've just to say, I mean, when I grew up, of course, I remember that you go into in a typical room in your house, you'd have the light on and maybe the TV, and that's it. You go into, certainly in our house, there are umpteen appliances working all the time. That's part of the difficulty, but we don't think about these things.
That's so interesting. It's really interesting, Steve. And I see, Nick, you've got your hand up, but just, I mean, it's funny. I was approached yesterday by Evergen Solar trying to sell me some solar panels and a battery, a Duracell lithium-ion battery, which would store this energy that solar panels would make. And he was telling me that the this package that they sell you trades your electricity that you're generating off your roof 200 trades a day, just from the AI that they've embedded in the system, which I was quite interested in. But may I just say, we're launching our book next Friday midday. Everybody is most welcome to come along. It's a Zoom panel discussion. It's just an hour, 12 midday on Friday next week till 1 o'clock. And we've got a great lineup with Jonathan Porrat, with the economist Vicky Price, with Margot James, former MP for Stourbridge in the Midlands, now executive chair of WMG at the University of Warwick, and Steve and myself. And I hope I haven't omitted anybody, but everybody is welcome. And I can get the Zoom link over to Nick.
I've put the Zoom, sorry,
have you done that?
I put it in the chat. I put the
Thanks.
link in the chat with the passcode. Yeah, I've done that.
I just wanted to make a point. Sorry, can I say a point about blockchain and Bitcoin?
Yeah, in fact,
Bitcoin is based on the blockchain principle, on the ledger principle, but blockchain does not use energy. Blockchain is just Bitcoins just take massive amounts. It's about the creation of the Bitcoin. The blockchain, a blockchain ledger carrying, for instance, all the parts in an aeroplane, which is one of the uses you can do a blockchain for. That's not, the energy consumption element is different entirely for blockchain than it is for Bitcoin, even though Bitcoin is a ledger-based technology. Shut up, Nick. Graham, good evening.
Good evening. Very interesting presentation by Stephen and Beverly, and interesting comments by others. My worldview is quite cynical. And when you look at the tiny sliver that Nick said that, the UK is, that you're talking about what we have to do, I think what we do isn't going to make a difference, and China and Germany and everybody else will carry on doing this. So I think that the horrible things that are happening with ice melting and everything else are going to happen. And I think as a country, we should be looking into preparing our country for the impacts. So all the low-lying areas are going to get impacted. We're going to get more floods, storm surges and stuff. And we should be investing in that, because we haven't got long before these horrible things happen. And while it's just a big talking shop, trying to talk China and even India was a huge number. Now, those countries are growing countries, and they can't turn around quickly. We've said how hard it is for us to turn around. These countries are not going to do it. So we're going to have to face the consequences, and we should be planning to deal with them now.
I'm going to ask a question off the back of that, because I think that's a great point, Graham. But the question I had jotted down was, even if other countries, and big ones at that, don't follow the path, is it still worth us as a nation, for our own benefit, going to net zero? I know it doesn't pay off in planetary terms, and we could all be knee deep by 2050, but does it in economic and social terms still pay off for us?
Well, Stephen's got his hand up.
Yeah, there's quite a few hands up. Be interested in
Okay.
Stephen and Roy's views, actually. Stephen.
Yeah.
I'm with Graham. I think we do need to have a backup plan, but the opportunity in developing the technologies, as I see, is to an extent owning the IP, owning the intellectual property, owning the skills, and then being able to build a modern economy based on exporting and exploitation of those skills. Yeah, I mean, you've got to be realistic. We've got to make money. So I think that sort of green knowledge economy is something where we could do very well. We're pretty good at that sort of science. Yeah. But it does mean being able to. It does involve China, because it does mean the rule of law and property rights and things like that, and how you do actually benefit from the knowledge and skills that you've developed. But that is sort of one path that I do see as a possibility and a realistic vision for the country.
Yeah. So that really rather supports what I was suggesting, that it's worth doing anyway. Yeah. Because it's good. Yeah. It's going to be good for us. Okay. Thank you.
Exactly. Yeah.
Can I ask Roy, because Roy and I see Michael's got it, but Roy, did you agree with Stephen?
Yeah, I do agree with Stephen, actually. And some of the other points that we discussed, we mentioned nuclear briefly. The fact that we're building massive nuclear power stations, I think that's a mistake. There are modular nuclear power stations around. I've worked in the nuclear industry. I'm a lapsed metallurgist, so I've got an interest in lots of things that are going on, and things like green steel. I wrote to Nick last week about, if we are actually making things, if we're buying things and using them in this country, then in a circular economy, why are we exporting that again when we could actually use all the steel we've got? Because surely we can't go on needing more and more steel or more precious metals if we actually start recycling them, because these are all finite resources, and we will run out of them. So if we start now in actually leading in some of these things. And I think green steel is a classic case that we ought to look at. Everybody says, "Oh no, we need to have basic steel." Well, do you really need basic steel? Have we already got enough steel? You know,
this is why Gupta's problems are a real issue. Gupta's problems at Liberty Steel are a huge issue because he was actually leading on the electric arc furnace revolution with green steel, and I think that may take a nasty hit because of his financial engineering issues.
Yes, but Michael. Michael.
Question to the authors. We've defined the issue quite in some depth, and emissions and so on. I wonder, from a business point of view, can we expect that there will be regulations coming into place which will be imposed on small and medium, large businesses, which say that you have to limit your emissions, limit your carbon, or whatever it is, by such and such a date? Therefore, they will have to invest in their own businesses in order to make them green compliant.
Yeah,
well, there's an investment side that they have to come up with, but also there are those businesses which will need to make input into those businesses to make them carbon compliant and so on. So there's a lot of, and there are business implications here. I wonder if you have a take on that.
Well, certainly from the Manufacturing Commission, as I was saying a little bit earlier, Michael, they really, one of their key recommendations in terms of sustainability was to bring forward the labelling of products produced so that the embedded carbon was really clear for the consumer as to what they actually were buying. And I think there was a comment I noticed in one of the chapters that sort of OEMs reckon about 30% of their carbon is in the supply chain, their carbon emissions is in the supply chain. So I think, you know, if that's 2025, well, that's only around the corner. So I think there will be big changes for manufacturers, absolutely.
That means that's the implication for labelling, that they have to have note their carbon content. Then on the other hand, they also have to get their carbon content down in certain limits. That is a big deal, I would guess.
Well, absolutely. You know, I mean, if we're all that coupled with the reductions of 78% by 2035 for the country, and given that I think manufacturing industry was 21% of our emissions, I think that those things working together will lead to the conclusion that you're just pointing out there.
Yeah, the industry, and then there are houses which have got to increase the insulation.
But,
anybody in insulation or that.
So I think the housing and heating is a massive issue, and I mean, you know, the numbers that Steve highlighted in his slides are one thing, but again, Vicky Price says that actually heating is something like, I think it was 70% of emissions globally. It's the major issue, frankly, globally. So.
That's why the MMC, the Modern Methods of Construction chapter, is particularly interesting, I think, in your book. I'm looking forward to reading that bit, because that actually brings manufacturing into construction, because modern methods of construction basically are houses made in factories, they're modular construction, and off-site, and then put up in a matter of days once on site. It changes construction forever, which has to be good news, because houses made nowadays are such lousy quality, such lousy insulation. This will mean houses being made to manufacturing standards, and that is no bad thing. That will help.
If we could find someone who would differ with your opinion, who could set the brick man on you. There's a friend of ours he's a big fan of brick.
An in-joke, I think, probably, but yeah.
Ibstock, is it? Ibstock.
Oh yeah, exactly right. Yeah, absolutely. Richard looks like he wants to come back in.
Yeah, just one small quick point, because I realise we're running out of time. Modular nuclear reactors, another good thing that we know about, and so I think it's the development of the nuclear reactor in our nuclear submarines, and these modular power stations, Rolls-Royce is talking about 450 megawatts, which is effectively 400,000 people. So you could have one of these around each town, each town or major town or small city, and you take the reactor to site on the back of a truck. And it seems to me that that's another one of our bets that we could go for. It's relatively low risk. Probably about a seventh of the output, an eighth of the output of a Hinkley Point. But what would happen in war with Hinkley Point? Surely it's the biggest target, you know, in the country, and with the biggest concrete pour. I think it's the biggest concrete pour in the world for Hinkley Point. So modular nuclear reactors, I think, is something that we should all be getting behind, and it's great for northern manufacturing as well.
Thank you.
They've got one running in Derby at the moment, Rolls-Royce and SMR, haven't they? Yeah. I think SMRs are fantastic ideas. And again, we're there, you know, we're there. This is one of the things, if we want to be world beating, world leading and all that, with wearing
and so exportable. So exportable.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, guys, 4 minutes to go. Final thoughts. Roy, hi.
Yeah, just on the nuclear thing again. I mean, 70% of the electricity generated in France is nuclear. We are the leaders in the enrichment of uranium, along with Urenco. I know it's also it's a joint venture with Germany and Holland, but the technology of that, which was floated off a couple of years ago, is streets ahead of everybody else. In fact, the Americans bought it, and I did some work with Urenco in actually a couple of workshops, but it was, you know, helping them get over some of the issues of actually building a plant in America. And it's the economy of these things is quite significant. The preparation of the fuel. France was using, I don't know, a number of nuclear reactors just to enrich uranium, but we have this centrifugal process. And that, instead of you requiring a number of nuclear reactors, only required one in order to enrich the uranium. So there's all kinds of things in there that you know, that could be looked at, but we're not blowing the trumpet. And people are frightened of nuclear. I don't know why. I mean, I've handled uranium in my bare hands, and I'm still here, and I'm quite old. So well, there's a lot of scaremongering goes on, you know.
Chernobyl is I suppose the sort of the big issue. People associated with that, and was it 3 Mile Island umpteen years ago?
Yeah, but nothing escaped from 3 Mile Island.
I know that. I know.
And Chernobyl was a stupidity thing, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, there've only been, I think the only other major accident was actually at what was called wind scale in those days, and we learned from that. And what also people also forget that when we actually started to build power stations in this country, you know, and early boilers, they frequently blew up. And if you read the insurance report from British Engine and one of those, and Vulcan Insurance, you know, you can read stories of 200 houses being laid waste as a result of a boiler explosion in those days. And unfortunately, I live to say it, but there is a cost associated with advancement in these things. But I think we've got over that with nuclear. We should have.
Okay, I'm going to have to bring proceedings very gently to a close. Please, July 16th in your diary for the launch. That promises to be a really interesting hour. I look forward to that one. Next week, Andy Dorset, who's head of R&D at Procter and Gamble, introduced by Ram, for which I'm very grateful. Actually, I think Ram had to go. I think his 10-month-old was giving him some jip. A very interesting tale to tell at Procter and Gamble about how they're using sensors and AI in quality control in real time rather than batch testing, which may sound quite boring, but actually is fascinating because it has massive implications for efficiency and waste. And Procter and Gamble, as we know, are huge producers of good stuff, but also waste. Listen, that's it. Witching hour. Thank you all for joining us. Beverly, Stephen, thank you so much for that. Really interesting. Julian, thank you for your part in this fantastic effort.
Thank you, Julian. Yes, cheers. Somebody said cheers.
It's one of those things. Listen, bless you all. Thank you very much. I'll see you next week.
See you on Friday and before.
Oh yeah. Of course.
Before.